Hi, everyone. I think a few people are just joining us from the lobby now. I might make a little start and people can slowly enter the chat. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name's Shannon Creaney. I am the Birds on Farms Monitoring Coordinator for Vic and WA. Now, I'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which I am calling in from today, and that's the Wadawurrung people. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands of which you are joining in today, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty has not been ceded. Now, welcome to our third session of our Your Birds on Farms webinar series. Tonight's topic is data analysis with Dr. Caroline Wilson, who is our Yarra TA project coordinator. And I also have our Birds on Farms manager, Margot Orobic, here moderating the chat with me. This evening is a wonderful opportunity to gain deeper insights into what we're learning from our Birds on Farm surveys. So to better understand the reasoning behind why we gather this data and how we're interpreting this information. And so it's a great way to see how your contributions are really shaping our understanding of bird populations on farms. Now, before we begin, as always, a tiny bit of housekeeping. Cameras this evening will be on, but audio will be off for attendees. You're welcome to ask questions throughout the session using either the chat or the Q&A function. Now, depending on how you have entered the webinar tonight, you might only see chat or you might see Q&A or even both. We will be moderating both and looking in those. And tonight will also be recorded and it will be uploaded to the Birds on Farms YouTube channel. And our previous webinars are also there if there's anything that you've missed. It typically takes us about a week or two to get those recordings up, but if you need to leave at any point, just know it will be there. So now I'm really pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, and that is Caroline Wilson. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'll just share my screen. You just bear with me. Okay, sorry about that. My name is Caroline, and thank you so much for everyone for tuning in tonight. I just wanted to mention first, I'm based in the outskirts of Melbourne, so I'm on Wurundjeri land. The work that I'll be presenting tonight, it covers much of Victoria and also part of southern New South Wales. So I just wanted to acknowledge and pay respects to all of the First Nations people whose land this project was carried out on. So just a little bit of an outline of what I'll be talking about tonight. I think most of you would probably be pretty familiar with the monitoring that we do, but I'm just going to give a bit of a recap and a history on that and kind of a bit of a method section, I suppose, which will lead in then to the findings of the data analysis that we did a couple of years back. And then from these findings, I'll talk about implications for habitat restoration and farm management. So just a quick recap on Birds on Farms and what we do. So Birds on Farms, we are Australia-wide and we operate on multiple states across Australia. We try and we're slowly expanding to the distribution of temperate woodland birds, which are our main focus for Birds on Farms. We have over 300 properties throughout these blue areas on the map. I think we'll probably be closer to 400 these days where, we've got quite a few properties involved. And as part of our Birds on Farms program, we've got three main components. Sorry, I'm just trying to change my screen's doing something weird. Okay, three main components. So we've got the monitoring that we do, which is a citizen science program. And we also support landholders to do habitat restoration for woodland birds and in key areas. And we have like a community engagement and education component as well. But tonight I'll be focusing on the monitoring side of things, since the monitoring data is what we have used in this analysis. So the monitoring that we do, so as I mentioned before, one of our main focuses for birds on farms is temperate woodland birds. So temperate woodland birds are one of our most threatened groups of birds in Australia, and this is largely due to habitat loss and also fragmentation and modification of the existing habitat and what's left. Much of the remaining woodland habitat is on private rural land, so roughly around 70%. So it's critically important to do this monitoring and to keep an eye on these birds for supporting them and their habitat on this rural land. So, and that way we can help manage their habitat, but also understand how different species are responding to restoration efforts, so we can adapt habitat and farm management accordingly. We also use the monitoring to identify key areas for conservation and restoration. And birds in general are acknowledged as good indicators for ecological condition. So they can tell us also a lot about the health of remnant vegetation on farms and the sustainability and suitability of agricultural practices as well. And then a big part of our why we do the monitoring is it's really important engagement tool. So like I mentioned, it's a citizen science program. So having the landholders and bird watching volunteers and the rural community involved in the monitoring is a great way to educate this community. Ooh. Slides just went a bit funny. So the aims of the analysis that we did, so we actually did this analysis back in 2022. So we were 5 years into Birds on Farms at this stage. We had a little bit of funding to do the analysis, and we wanted to see get some preliminary results, I suppose, and see what we're finding so far 5 years in. So we teamed up with BirdLife's data and analytics team. They helped us run the data analysis and did all the tests. Birds on Farm staff organised all the data and did all the entry. It's a big data set, so it was a bit of an undertaking. But the main things we wanted to look at for this preliminary analysis was to look at the woodland bird responses to different habitat and environmental variables, and also how they're responding to land use and farm management and restoration as well. So this analysis, like I said, it was carried out in 2022. So back then, our biggest data set was for Victoria-wide and then also southern New South Wales around Albury and Holbrook. This is where we started the monitoring back in 2017. So it was our biggest data set at the time. Obviously, we've expanded into other areas now. But this data set was 220 Birds on Farms properties, and just shy of 900 survey plots were included in the analysis. And most of you will probably be familiar with how we collect our data and how we operate with our citizen science program, but just a quick recap. So the surveys that were included in the analysis were used using the 2 hectare 20-minute survey technique. So this is a standardized technique that we use for a lot of our BirdLife programs, so the data can be comparable. So basically all our Birds on Farms plots are 2 hectares in size and they're surveyed for 20 minutes. Most of our Birds on Farms properties have 3 to 4 survey plots, and these are surveyed 4 times a year to capture seasonal changes and variations in the woodland bird community. The data is entered into our bird data portal, and the people who collected the data, the volunteers and the landholders, are experienced, and we have training programs and mentorship programs to help with this. And the data is also vetted as well. I just popped a screen grab here of our habitat assessment form. Some of you might recognise this. This is the paper form that we used to use before we incorporated this habitat assessment into our bird data module. But this was basically the backbone of this data analysis. Like, these forms we use to collect so much information. They're used generally when we set up a plot, when we first set up a plot, as a once-off kind of snapshot of the plot and the surrounding area, and to look at the different habitat and land management variables that are likely to influence birds. So this was a big part of the analysis that we did. Sorry, my slides are a bit funny. So just talk about some of the variables that we did test. So each of us, the survey plots, and some of you would know this already, but the survey plots that we incorporate into birds on farms, each of them represents a broad habitat type. So we have plots that are remnant woodland, we have plots that are paddocks with or without trees. We have plots that are production areas, and this can include like orchards, crops, plantations, and vines. We have farmhouse garden plots, and then we have plots that are restored areas. So this was one of the things we were interested in looking at, and to see what kind of broad habitats the birds were using. And then we included a bunch of variables from a habitat form that I mentioned before. This is just a selection of the ones we included, but we looked at a lot more. But we did incorporate variables around farm management, so things like irrigation and grazing regime. We also included things like time since wildfire, and if there was restoration, we looked at the age of restoration activities. And then we looked at habitat variables such as tree hollows, mistletoe, shrubs, tree cover, things that we know that are likely to influence woodland birds. So yeah, a lot of the variables were from this habitat form that we had volunteers and landholders fill out. And then we did include a couple of landscape level variables in our analysis, things we knew that were going to influence the birds. So we calculated patch size and connectivity using aerial photographs and our mapping programs as well. And because woodland birds are a big group of birds and they're quite variable in how they use their habitat, so we know that they're probably likely going to react differently to some of the different variables we're testing. So we separated the birds into guilds, which are based on life history traits, so things like foraging and nesting habits. And we also did our testing looking at all woodland birds combined as well. So we looked at all these separate guilds and woodland birds combined. So now getting into the result side of things, we found that quite a few of the variables were significant drivers of woodland birds. So this included the habitat variables that were collected in our forms, and also those two landscape variables were important too that I mentioned before, the patch size and connectivity. And I'll talk about some of the things that came out as interesting findings in relation to that. But interestingly, land use and farm management variables didn't really show up as significant predictors of the woodland bird guilds or for the woodland birds combined. And these were things like the grazing regimes and irrigation and that sort of thing. So it was mostly the habitat variables that were the main drivers in this analysis. So this graph shows those broad habitat types that I told you about. So each of our survey plots represents a broad habitat type. This is for all woodland birds combined, and this shows you all the broad habitat types. So in this particular test, we tested against what's called a null hypothesis, and in this instance, we chose remnant woodland. I guess this is considered the most natural and unmodified of all of the habitats, so we compared everything against this. And we found that remnant woodland that contains some sort of restoration. So this might have been remnant woodland that's been fenced off and allowed to regenerate, or infill planting and things like that. But we found that these remnant woodlands with restoration had a higher species richness compared to remnant woodlands without. This wasn't significant, but we found that areas with restoration alone, so this is restored areas that are from bare ground or restored paddocks, that sort of thing, where there's no existing vegetation or little. These areas had very similar species richness to the remnant woodland, which was quite interesting. And we also found that the farmhouse, this is called house plot here, but the farmhouse gardens had significantly more species richness than remnant woodland, which was another interesting finding as well. And then perhaps a little less surprising was the paddock plots. Paddocks with no trees and paddocks with trees, which were generally sort of scattered paddock trees, had significantly less species compared to the remnant. And I'll just sort of flesh out some of these findings now with some extra slides. So as I mentioned, the remnants that had some sort of restoration carried out had high species richness compared to remnants without. And this is pretty likely due to improved habitat structure through any sort of planting or natural regen that's carried out in these plots. And this diverse habitat structure is obviously going to be beneficial for a range of species. It's going to improve things like, it's going to result in things like higher insect abundance and more feeding substrates and more shelter from aggressive species as well, like nosy miners, more nesting opportunities. And it tends to be the smaller species, so things like thornbills, robins and wrens that prefer this sort of well-structured shrubby vegetation. So it makes sense that the birds were preferring this. And just a few practical things, I guess, if you want to improve habitat structure on your property, if you do have remnant vegetation or patches of vegetation where you feel like your understory is a bit lacking, then protecting these areas from grazing is a really important one. And also things like infill planting, particularly if things aren't popping up on their own, if the area is protected, can be quite beneficial as well for increasing this habitat structure. And also mention that restored areas alone, so these were more like the plantings that were from bare ground or from paddocks, had a similar species richness to the remnant woodland, which was interesting. It's obviously going to be dependent on the age of the restoration, which actually as a standalone variable didn't really have much influence in the analysis. We looked at different ages of habitat restoration. But we do know that with restoration plantings, as they increase in age, there's going to be more species richness over time as habitat matures and provides more of a range of habitats for birds, and potentially then reaching a similar level to the remnant vegetation over time. And then the farmhouse gardens. So like I mentioned before, had significantly higher species richness compared to the remnant woodland. And in a way, it's not surprising. I think a lot of the farmhouse gardens at our properties and the ones I visited as well tend to have quite a diverse range of plants, including exotic species. But this then does provide more structural diversity, like I mentioned before, which is important for providing food and shelter and nest sites for a range of species. I guess one of the things we do suggest with farmhouse gardens and gardens in general, people like to, I think, plant species like grevilleas, which are great, and they have a rich nectar source, but planting too many of these types of plants, I guess, can attract more of the aggressive birds like wattlebirds. So perhaps having a few of these plants rather than overdoing it can be beneficial for the smaller birds that tend to get pushed out by these species. And then for the individual habitat variables that came out in the analysis as being important for the birds or for woodland birds, mistletoe was a big one. So this graph shows the honeyeater guild, and each bar represents the number of trees which contain mistletoe. So the more mistletoe there was, the more honeyeaters there were. Mistletoe was important for a few of the different woodland bird guilds and for woodland birds combined, but also was important for a ground foraging guild, which was interesting. But it has been something that's been found in other studies as well. So even though mistletoe can make up a fairly small proportion of what's in the canopy, it can contribute disproportionately high volume to nutrient-rich litter in the understory, and therefore important for ground foraging species, including our birds. But obviously mistletoe is important for honeyeaters and for mistletoe birds. They've got quite a long flowering and fruiting time, so they're more of like a long-term dependable food source for these species. There's a little bit of a misconception, I think, sometimes that mistletoe can cause stress to the host tree. But in healthy sort of functioning ecosystems, trees are rarely impacted in this way by mistletoe. Some of the properties that I work with have found that fencing, particularly if there are sort of individual paddock trees that are host trees, which are more likely to be susceptible to stress anyway, but fencing off these trees can be beneficial to their health and I guess be less stressed when they do have mistletoe. If you're wanting to add more mistletoe to your property, if you're finding you don't have much mistletoe and you want to include it, because obviously it's important for birds and insects and all sorts of things, you can actually transplant the seeds. So we've got a mistletoe propagation guide, which some of you might have seen if you went to the mistletoe webinar a few weeks back. But this was developed by our Woodland Birds team. So if you're interested, it's sort of a manual, I guess, on how to transplant and propagate mistletoe. And it's actually not as, I don't think, as hard or onerous as it sounds. So if you're interested, there's a QR code there. Also, if you wanted to look at the mistletoe webinar that we did, as Shannon said, we've got the Birds on Farms YouTube page, so you can have a look recording of that if you're interested and want to find out more. And then another habitat variable that was important was the presence of hollow-bearing trees. So this graph shows, similar to the mistletoe one, it's the number of trees with hollows. So as that goes up, as does the species in the hollow nesting guild, which makes sense. The presence of hollow-bearing trees also was beneficial for the frugivore, which are fruit-eating, or large bird guilds as well. I mean, and large bird guilds. And at a closer look, these guilds did contain a number of hollow-dependent species like lorikeets and cockatoos. So obviously it's not surprising that hollow-bearing trees are important for these species that depend on them. And most of you would know that they can take centuries to form, so they're very an important resource. On farms, they like the mature isolated paddock trees. And these trees, as well as being important for nesting and for tree hollows, they're also important for things like stepping stones and providing shade and shelter for stock and wildlife. And also these sorts of paddock trees, to help protect them, I guess, and to promote the health and make sure that they live as long as they can and that they're thriving. Fencing off these trees can be really important, not just to improve their health, but it also helps with things like soil disturbance if there is stock on the property, and promoting understorage. And then these areas can kind of be more like habitat islands on a property. And also fencing them off can allow for new seedlings to emerge as well, which will then eventually replace these mature trees once they're eventually gone from the landscape. Nest boxes are a good substitute, or a good short-term substitute. Not all species will take to them, but there can be some species. We suggest to always tailor nest boxes, I guess, for specific target species. So have a look at what hollow-dependent species are likely to occur in your area, and then provide the nest box accordingly. I really like this Nest Box Tales website. It has really good information and really good designs and for different nest boxes specific to different species. And something we can do as well, if you have questions about nest boxes, we can have a look at what hollow-dependent species are in your area and what might benefit from a nest box if you don't have many hollows on your property. And then noisy miners. So in the analysis that we did, noisy miner presence resulted in a significant decrease in 6 of the different bird guilds, including small birds and honeyeaters. It's not really surprising, I suppose, as we know how much of influence they can have on other woodland bird species. They're quite aggressive. And the presence of noisy miners could be linked to the open habitat in some of the survey plots that we included in the analysis. One of the things that we usually suggest for deterring noisy miners is to increase understory levels and provide more kind of mid and understory structure. They tend to prefer open habitat and edges, so providing this understory could be a way to deter them. And also it allows for the smaller birds that they're more likely to chase away. It allows them to have somewhere to hide and to seek shelter. And then I mentioned before, we included the 2 landscape variables that we worked out using aerial photographs and mapping program. So we found that for overall species richness, so all species, the woodland guilds combined, but also for a number of the individual guilds, the increased patch size and connectivity had a significant positive effect, which wasn't overly surprising. This has been found in a number of studies. But connectivity, it's obviously important for movement and dispersal of our woodland birds, and also for accessing resources, including mates, and allowing for that genetic variation. So things to improve connectivity on your property for wildlife and for birds and wildlife in general is to protect what's already there, and including things like corridor networks that kind of naturally occur, like along roadsides or waterways. As I mentioned before, the sort of paddock trees, the isolated paddock trees, can be important as stepping stones, particularly if they have been fenced off, and they can act as those sort of habitat islands. And also creating corridors to connect existing vegetation. A lot of studies say that wider corridors around 30 metres or more width is going to have more species using them. This can be pretty tricky on a lot of farms if you don't have that amount of land to give up. So even corridors that are, 10, 20 metres wide are still going to be beneficial, and they're still going to be used by a lot of birds. And then patch size as well. So obviously the larger patches is going to be more habitat. And larger patches do tend to provide more of a buffer from surrounding agriculture and things like that, and potentially have less pressure from like edge specialists like noisy miners. But I just want to point out, I guess, that smaller patches are important as well, like for things like stepping stones, like I mentioned before, and they still offer a range of important resources. In general, I think a combination of large and small patches can be beneficial for maintaining a diverse range of species and ecosystem functions. So in summary, from our analysis, the variables that were important for woodland birds on farms were remnant woodland with restoration carried out, farmhouse gardens, and mistletoe, tree hollows, noisy miners, but in a negative way, and habitat connectivity and patch size. So not surprising, and they do reflect research from other groups, but they also do contribute to broader knowledge of these systems. So this information is really important. And how has this analysis been used? So we are in the process of trying to get it published. We're currently in the process of editing a manuscript for our journal, so that way it can reach a wider audience. Some of the results have been fed into our bird-friendly farm guide, which is pictured here, and also fed into our habitat restoration plans that we write for individual property owners as well. In terms of future analysis, so in 2027, that will be 10 years since we started this iteration of Birds on Farms. So I think it would be good to do some more analysis then, and that way we can start looking at sort of changes over time, particularly for properties that were surveyed back at the start. and potentially focus a bit more on restoration techniques and look at what's working for woodland birds. And I just wanted to pop in this slide just to really further emphasize the importance of the monitoring data that we collect. So all of the birds on farm surveys that we do, they're also incorporated into a much larger pool of data. So they go into our bird data portal. And all of this data, it helps inform us on bird conservation status. It helps alert us to see if there's any declines in bird species, and elevate conservation status for threatened species. It's all really important, and this data set basically is what informs anything bird related in all of Australia. So it's really important. And one of the good things about birds on farms as well is it allows us to access broad birds in areas that might otherwise be missed on private land. Particularly because we know that a lot of private land can have woodland, and it's going to be important for threatened woodland birds. And I really like this map here. This is, I think it's a 17-year snapshot of bird surveys from our bird data portal. And this map of Australia doesn't have any lines. It's actually just made up. Each red dot is where a survey has been carried out. So you can just see the sheer volume of data that's collected, predominantly through citizen science as well. So it's pretty amazing. And that's it from me. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. And I guess over to you, Shannon.
Thank you very much.
No worries.
I find it very interesting, and I think it helps to put into context why we're doing what we're doing, and helping you to understand why we ask for these little extra additional bits of information when we're doing the surveys, and how we're then applying them. So it goes much more beyond one individual property and the birds we're seeing. It helps to show that we're such a part of such a big collective. I think it's so important. Now, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat or the Q&A function. And I also just did want to mention that you would have seen the Bird Friendly Farms booklet in one of the previous slides. If you haven't received a copy of that via email, I can send them out to you, or if you just email the coordinator who you have contact with, we can send you a PDF copy, and that's really helpful, and it shows what this information is being used for and how you can apply that to your property if you're not already. Margot, was there anything that you'd like to add as well?
No, I think you've covered it all. Thank you very much, Caroline, for doing this presentation. It's really important to show what aspects of a woodland that are the most important to increase the woodland bird population. So really noting that having, revegetation within a remnant woodland increases the woodland bird population there and increases the number of species that are able to use it. That's very important to realize. So it's one of those things that we shouldn't just focus on protecting remnant woodlands, but it's also really important to increase that, the quality of that woodland by having regeneration happening in the area or revegetation. So it's really a combined trait of having young trees as well as having old trees that really improves the habitat for woodland birds. And then it's always nice to know that, there's little aspects that you can do, like increasing mistletoe, increasing nest hollows, and especially getting rid of those pesky, noisy miners. That's like the three main points that landholders can undertake. So yeah, thank you very much, Caroline, for explaining through all of that and running through all the data we've collected.
Thank you, Nia. A question has popped up in the chat from Christine. Hello, Christine. Christine's noticed reduced numbers of flame robins outside her plots, but they're outside of the plots. So what's the best way to record this?
Yeah, Caroline? Or
Is it right, Maggie? You go.
I was just going to say that the best way to record this would be to do either create an area outside of your plot, just create another site, or you can incidental it. So if you're just going into the bird data app and you're going to the general bird data surveys, There you can do incidental sightings, and you can just log it for your property. And then you can, if you do that on a regular basis, whenever you see the flame robins, you can see that, whether they're increasing over time or whether they're decreasing. And it's really a good way of keeping note of how many flame robins are on your property. So yeah, go to bird data, go to the app, fill out the general bird data survey and click on incidental for that one.
And can I add, I also recommend when you are entering surveys, feel free to use that little notes area where you can just sort of freehand write some notes as well. I do always look through all of the notes and see anything of significance in there. So that's a good way to just, if there's something that you're a little bit uncertain about or something that you thought was worth mentioning, yeah, you can definitely pop them in the notes as well. Just checking for any other questions. Oh, okay, here we go. I have a question from John. Thanks, Caroline, for a very informative presentation. What does the data tell us about water supply? So dams, bird baths, etc.
Yeah, that was included as one of the questions in our habitat form, the different types of water, pretty much including those things, and creek lines and that sort of thing. From memory, I don't think it came up as something that was influencing the birds in this particular analysis. Yeah, we looked at it, I think we looked at water within the plot itself and then just outside of the plot too. And that would have been included in the analysis, but it's not something that came out as like a significant thing for birds, even though we know it probably would be. But in this particular analysis, it didn't come out it. Yeah.
But that is something that we're continuing to monitor in the Birds on Farms module as well now. So we will have that ongoing data about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And okay. I think as well at Shannon, we're looking at if that changes as well, because obviously it's something that can change if water sources dry up and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Quite interesting.
Okay, and now another question from Kendra. Any tips on what the best bird identification apps for those of us who are new to bird spotting?
Yeah, I saw that one. I use the Michael Morecambe app, like the Birds of Australia, I think it's called, but it is one that you have to pay for. Like I think it was initially $30 when I first got it, but I've had it for like, I don't know, 8 years or something, and I don't think I've had to update it or anything like that. It's been really good, and one of the reasons I like it, I think, because it has so many of the bird calls in it. It has pretty much bird calls for every species in Australia, so it's great for cross-referencing bird calls, because I think with woodland birds in particular, sometimes it's hard to get a good look at them, so knowing their calls can be quite important. I don't know, Shannon and Margot, have you used any of like the AI type ones where you can actually record the calls and it works out what it is? I know a few people have been talking about those recently, but I haven't used them myself.
I've tried using one. Merlin is one of the more famous ones for recording the sound and analyzing it. Unfortunately, the database of calls within for Australian birds is quite limited still. And so the accuracy is very, very low. So I wouldn't recommend it at the moment. It will improve over time, and it usually improves quite fast. But it is something that we need to have more calls from a large variety of areas, because the birds all have different accents in different parts of the country. They all need to be recorded to reliably identify a bird species. So for Australia, if people want to start using those apps, we really need to start recording more sounds of birds. So if people are able to do it, it's definitely something that's worthwhile. They can be recorded and they can be either submitted to, websites like Xena-Canto or eBird. But yes, it's unfortunately not something that works really well in Australia just yet.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing, but yeah, improving over time. But
yeah,
Yeah.
BirdNet is another one that starts now, and they have automatic recorders that you can put out, and they record the species. Their accuracy is getting quite reasonable. There's just some birds that haven't had too many recordings done yet, and those are just misidentified.
Yeah, I think that's similar to bird weather. Is that someone mentioned bird weather as well? I think that's a similar type of thing.
But Merlin is organizing a workshop. I'm not sure, Zoe. I know because eBird is based mostly in America. I'm not sure what they're organizing. It's if you want to check it, eBird probably has it mentioned, or you can contact them to ask about it. But there are a few people that are working on establishing Australian databases for bird calls, and hopefully they interact with each other and share their data, so it goes a bit faster.
I'll say, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was just going to mention another app as well that it's the BirdLife Aussie Backyard Bird Count app. I find that really good, not so much for calls, but for visually identifying birds. Like if you're quite new to that, it's got a really good tool within the app. Even if it's not Aussie Backyard Bird Count time, you can still use it. And it kind of narrows down what you're seeing based on shape, size, colour. And then it works out where you are, knows where you are. So it kind of narrows down what you're seeing and gives you a few options. So I think that's quite a good beginner's tool as well, and it's free. So,
yep. Caroline, there's also a question from Jared Laurie back to the analysis of what we've done for the birds on farms. And he had the question, does your analysis highlight the impact of broader landscape rainfall, such as the water flowing through the central Australia? Are bird migration patterns shifted around water availability?
Yeah, this analysis certainly didn't go into that level of detail. I think it was pretty preliminary, this analysis, and I think if we did further analysis, we could potentially look into things like that, but not for this particular one, no. But water does definitely make a big difference, so it's going to influence what the birds are doing and where they're going. So,
yeah. Jared just wanted to say that I'm based around the ACT and yes, and we do notice it quite a bit when there's more water available inland. A lot of those birds don't move to the coast in summer. They only tend to move to the coast when it's really dry inland and they're trying to follow the water sources. So yeah, the water seems to have a fairly strong influence on the migration patterns of birds around here. And Janet, there you go. And Janet is saying, would it be interesting to relate your data to annual rainfall for each year?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and potentially using like the Bureau of Meteorology, that some good data sources there. So that would definitely be interesting. Maybe for our 10-year analysis, if we can do some more around then.
Excellent. Well, I think that's everything in the chat answered. If anybody, oh, hang on. Yep. I think we've got everything. If anything else does come to mind once we've finished the webinar and something pops into your head the next day, please know that you can reach out to any of us with these questions, and we're more than happy to chat with you directly. Thanks again, Caroline, for this evening. We really appreciate it and appreciate everybody in attendance too. And I think we can probably wrap it up there. And thanks, Margot, too, as always, for helping me moderate the questions. And yeah, well, please, keep an eye out for the next update with our next invite to our webinar too. So we'll continue these bi-monthly. If you do have ideas for topics that you'd like to see, feel free to let us know as well. And Thea, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, everybody.